Hi folks, you were Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the overarching issue of a government or government instrumentalities or organisations surveilling and spying on their own citizens, citizens who may not have committed any crime, but who are appearing on watch lists for, well, a variety of reasons, which we can assume basically are ideological, and how justified that may or may not be given the circumstances at the time. Now, the 1950s and 1960s, in terms of the Black Power and Black civil rights movement, were one of those times where people in that movement who were associated with it or in support of it or were somehow indirectly connected to it, many were put under Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, surveillance. And whether that surveillance was sort of regular or permanent or occasional or intermittent, nonetheless, they were on various watch lists. Now, when we look at governments, spying on their own citizens and that sort of thing, and I'll do another video on this, but typically riots and so on were even tolerated in the most repressive societies that had arbitrary arrest and torture as a way of interrogation and murder on made up or invented charges, kangaroo courts. Even those societies, such as communist China and say communist Soviet Union and communist Eastern Europe, they still tolerated riots and public disturbances, provided that didn't threaten the power or the ideological underpinning of the power of the state. Now, if it threatened that, they'd move in swiftly and commit mass murder if they wanted to. But they would otherwise let riots and public disturbances go unmolested. Some were even encouraged if it was going to cause distress and inconvenience to class enemies, as they would call it in the communist system. But this is a little unique in the United States, going in the 1950s, 1960s, particularly given it revolved around the so-called black rights, or the civil rights as it was called, movement. Now, this didn't necessarily directly threaten the power of the state, as in the United States. The United States was really the only Western country that had a sizable Black minority. So there was the same circumstances in terms of first world countries didn't really exist anywhere else. So there was a certain uniqueness to that. Now the concerns were at the time were that the communist agitators and Marxist agitators had infiltrated or co-opted, if you like, the Black civil rights movement. So blacks that otherwise wouldn't have been particularly politicized or concerned about the situation, that those blacks were being made political and made politically active by the agitators. And there's a lot of truth in that, by the way. I mean, just before anyone says, well, the blacks were hard done by and oppressed and this, that, and the next thing in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, regardless of what you think about the vast majority of Black people in the United States had the highest standard of living of all blacks in the world. So the idea that they were uniquely oppressed or something like that is hard to accept when you look at the per capita average income of blacks in the United States compared to blacks anywhere else in the world, whether it be Africa or and in some cases the standard of living for blacks in the United States was, in terms of purchasing power and income, that sort of thing, 20 to 30 times higher than it was for many black countries in the United States. In fact, in Africa. In fact, if you look at where the African Americans primarily came from in Africa, you look at those particular states, they were sort of basket cases on triple steroids. So the standard of living for a black person in the United States was vastly higher than it was if you look at their ethnic and racial origins from where the tribal areas they would have come from in Africa. So this idea that they were uniquely oppressed or hard done by now what was looked at is, if you look at a sort of a middle of the middle class standard of living for a white family, and this is not an average one, this is middle of the middle class for a white family, why were the blacks not living that standard of living? Why are they not equal to that? Not the white guy on the Skid Row bum, white guy. They're not equal to that, but equal to a well-off, well-to-do, well, not rich, but doing pretty good white family. So the line of equality was, why are blacks not getting an equal outcome with those white people that are doing pretty good? Why are we not equal to that? We don't want to be equal to the poor white people. We want to be equal to the white people who are doing well. That's what we want. And if we're not equal to that, then we're oppressed. And it was that sort of rationale that was really around. Now there are other things, like there was the segregation thing, but it wasn't segregation based on race. It was segregation based on behaviour. Now, that's something that's overlooked. It's seen today, particularly in looking through today's social lens. It's viewed primarily racism. That's it. Racism. No other reason for it. And this is something that is put about. When you look at the segregation in some of in India and some of the third world countries there, where there was segregation there between Indians and upper class Indians and white people and so on. The reason was that Indian peasants would often defecate and urinate in train carriages, and they'd spit and so on, which was considered antisocial behaviour. So they were separated out from if you like the Brahmins and the white people and the upper class folks. So this was something that was done, and you even saw it in say England, where they had, or Britain, where there was first class, second class, and third class carriages. The riffraff went in the third class, and the polite society went in the first class carriages, and there were price differences to reflect that. But coming back to the civil rights thing, now the FBI's concern, and it was a genuine concern, is reasonable, it was accurate, that the black activist movement has been infiltrated by the communists, and they were applying, the black activists under communist tutelage and guidance were applying Marxist principles. Now the communists were quite sort of open about it. They said, look, the way to undermine American society is you attack the family and you attack the race issues. So if you can dismember the family and cause racial tensions, and particularly cause the white people to be going through spasms of shame and guilt for the treatment of the black people, then we've already undermined the society, and we should really exploit those tensions and those fault lines, which they did. Now again, non-active blacks were encouraged to become active. Do you know why you don't have a standard of living like that white family down, over in those other suburbs there? It's not because you don't have the education. It's not because you don't turn up for work. It's not because you're lazy and they're hardworking. It's not because you blow your money on booze or something. None of those reasons. It's because of fucking racism. You've heard of Hitler, have you? Hitler, fascist? Yeah, okay, that's why. And so they were. Again, some of these people were, not all of them. I mean, some of them were sophisticated enough, but this created a groundswell of activism that otherwise wouldn't have existed without the agitation. Now, the communist presence there was a great concern, because after the Second World War, the communists came into, the Soviet communists came into Eastern Europe and took over that and fixed and rigged elections and did all things to ensure that communist governments were put in place. As soon as the communists took over, then they banned all political opposition and so on. Now, we saw the thing in 1949 that China became communist. The communists infiltrated into various Southeast Asian areas. There were communist activities in many places in the world, attempted communist coups. There's an attempted communist coup in Greece. and so on. The list went on. So there was really a bit of a paranoia around about communist activity, and how various, and the methodologies of the communists were always the same. They would find a section of society, and it didn't matter what it was. It could be Jews, it could be blacks, it could be anyone that felt they were being marginalised, or some did for whatever reason, and they would use those people as, if you like, the stalking horse. The stalking horse, the cat's paw, to try and stir things up. So the concerns the FBI and the government had were very genuine. And on top of that, particularly the Soviet communists, they supported to some extent, at least, the Trotskyite view of Marxism and socialism, that it should be in a state of permanent revolution until it has spread all over the world. To Trotsky, his view was that communism will never be safe until it's the only system everywhere in the world. Only then can it be safe. And until that time, it must be in a state of permanent armed violent revolution. Now this was being seen around various places around the world, this violent armed revolution. And the Soviet constitution had built into it that they were obligated by their laws to assist and aid and abet any communist revolution, or any communist uprising. They were to provide arms and finance and so on. So this was something that alarmed, quite reasonably too, alarmed the US government, and where the FBI or the investigating sort of bureaus that were the forerunner of the FBI alarmed them quite considerably, that they needed to keep a close watch on this, because they didn't want a major uprising, or didn't want what in effect could be a minor civil war breaking out. And they were those concerns were very real, very real. They weren't imaginary. They weren't invented. They're not like the current thing of white supremacy. It's not like this was real. The communist revolution was backed by a very powerful nuclear power in the Soviet Union. They'd started, they'd been exploding nuclear bombs in the late 1940s. The size of their armed services was very substantial, and there was a view that if it came to warfare between the West and the Soviet bloc, that it would be a very close-run thing. It could even involve nuclear annihilation. So instead of going to nuclear war, each side decided to take the view of sort of checkmating neutralizing and forestalling any attempts to infiltrate and disrupt their societies. Now, given that the Soviet society is a very closed society, as indeed the Chinese one, it's far, far harder for the West to destabilize those societies. But in a relatively open society like the West, it was much, much easier for the communists to infiltrate and send agitators. And there were worldwide trade union movements, and blacks were encouraged to join trade unions in America, again under communist tutelage, and then go to these international trade union conventions in a communist country, in the Soviet Union, and discuss sort of Marxist theory, and to be trained to see how oppressed they were. Now, again, when you're trying to tell a sophisticated person that they're oppressed, it's a tough gig. But for example, someone comes to you and says, "You're not as rich as Bill Gates. Look how rich he is. You're not as rich as him. That means you're oppressed. You're a victim, and he is your oppressor." For example, I'm not suggesting that is a valid way of looking at things, but that level of silliness is how I'm simplifying it a bit, but how the agitation worked. You're lazy, you've got no education, or this, that sort of thing. You've only got affirmative action and bullshit qualifications, and see how that white family is working, living there. They've got a nice house, they've got this, they've got a nice car in the driveway. You don't have that because of racism. We have to restructure the entire society in order to make sure that you're equal to that guy. And I want that. I want that nice house and that car. So this waving of trinkets, these are the trinkets that a capitalist society can give you, So why don't you let's create a communist society so you can have those same trinkets? See, the logic just doesn't stack up, but this is what was put forward. Now, if you look at, say, the agitators back in the day, including Martin Luther King Jr. and so on, he led a life of orgies and indulgence while running around talking about everyone's character and how the slogans and the preacher type catchphrases he was putting out were obviously struck a chord with many people. I mean, if you say, well, you should be judged on the contents of your character, I mean, who could argue with that? That seems reasonably straightforward. But it was a view that it didn't appreciate any of the realities that existed in America at the time. It was a nice grand vision, and who could argue with it? But did it appreciate the realities? It didn't. So the FBI had some serious concerns. There were Soviet agitators. There were paid up Soviet pamphleteers and underground newspapers. There were unions that were controlled by Soviet agitators. There were Soviet agents that were coming over, stirring things up. Those things did exist. They were real. And there were numerous people in government that had managed to get in, particularly during the Roosevelt administration, that were very sympathetic to the Marxist cause, and very sympathetic to an imagined communist utopia where, but the imagination again was impractical. Everybody would be rich. Everybody would be rich and equal. That's not how communism works. I mean, in the practical reality of the day is everyone is not dirt poor and equal. There's somewhere between lower middle class and working class managing to survive. That's the bracket that communism gives you, or a planned economy and within a communist society gives you. So the realities were never there, but the surveillance of the people that we look at today and say, well, that's not really legal. Wiretaps were being approved, those sorts of things, and the going against the Constitution and various laws of the United States. Now, looking at it now, there's a parallel that's drawn with the surveillance that's going on white supremacists today, and we see the same. Some of the same things playing out. Now, there's two arguments here. Well, look, they did it then against black people and communists and Jews and that sort of thing. So why can't we do it against these white people today? You damn fucking fascist Nazi. No. If it was wrong then it would be wrong now. Is that not a lesson from the past to be learned? That when you go down that path, it takes you to a bad place, quite apart from being an illegal place, takes you to a bad place. Why repeat the mistakes of the past? Why not learn from the past? Say, hey, that was wrong then, it's wrong now. And now the second sort of thing to look at is the FBI, that even back then were contemplating and planning false flag operations and inserting their own agitators into various groups to make sure it turned violent. So they go, look at those violent people over there. Look at those, communists and so on. And today they're doing the same thing. In fact, the FBI, that's all the fucking FBI seems to do these days in the US, is insert their activist agents into any situation they can find to create a false flag operating. See those damn white supremacist fascists. There you go. We told you all along, when it was all an FBI set up in the first place. So if it was wrong then, it's wrong now. So should we be surveilling people today? Now then, if you look at the balance of probability and the evidence, they had far more cause back then. These are agents actively employed, funded and controlled by a foreign power, a very militaristic foreign power, which has an absolute and open commitment to world communist revolution, and that they will support, aid and abet and assist and arm those revolutions. So that's a very, very serious situation to be in, and one that should be taken seriously and should be monitored, given again that the stakes are quite high. The difference today is that there are people that don't accept the globalist ideology, the forced ideology that has to bypass democracy, the rule of law, due legal process and the independence of the judiciary. The globalist program has to bypass those things, not work within it. So there are people that are very concerned about that. So the FBI surveillance, or any intelligence service surveillance today, is you're disagreeing with the globalist program. We're going to say that makes you a criminal. We're going to surveil you and find ways to, destroy your life or put you in prison. That's a very different situation. The surveillance is the same, no matter where or who it's applied to. If it's illegal, it's illegal. But there's a difference. You're disagreeing with the globalist program, so we're going to treat you as a terrorist or a Nazi or whatever it might be. But there's no nation state that's backing this. There's no funding of it from any group. There's no agitators and organisers that are state sponsored. There's nothing of that. So the comparison with the 1950s and 1960s is minimal indeed, if at all. So the only issue left is state power, but the threat to state power doesn't exist here either. The people that don't like the globalist project do support the nation state. They do support the rule of law. They do support clean and fair and democratic elections. So they're not against state power. They're against the abuse and misuse of state power, and that's a big difference. Now, coming back to the black activist. If you look at the activist slogans from the 1950s and 1960s, it's straight out of the Marxist playbook, straight out of the Marxist playbook. I mean, Leon Trotsky, the Jewish agitator from the Bolshevik Revolution, he was very much into this world revolution thing, and he came out with the slogans, as indeed did Lenin and others, but Bukharin and so on. But those slogans were used by the black activists in the 1950s and 60s. And if you look at the slogans, the writings and so on, they're again straight out of the Marxist playbook. So the concern that the FBI had at the time, again, was very real. Whether or not it would have led to some sort of civil war and so on, as in armed civil war supported by the communist Soviet Union, that's another matter, and that probably is a little far-fetched. Not impossible, but given the paranoia of the time, where the communists were infiltrating countries all over the place, where communist agitators were just everywhere you looked, the Korean War and all that sort of stuff, then those concerns, the very powerful Soviet Union directly sponsoring this sort of agitation and undermining Western society, then the concerns were real, they were genuine, and some sort of surveillance maybe was warranted, not as wide and as broad as it was, but nonetheless. Now, the people that were drawn into the net, that you would hardly describe them as agitators, during the Great Depression, they may have attended some meeting in or gathering of people in that park in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Park, where it is, overlooks the bridge there. They may have attended some big food rally there, where people were being given like a soup kitchen type thing. They may have attended that, and FBI agents would have been taking names and taking photographs and so on, and so they appeared at that some sort of outdoor soup kitchen thing like that, and then they were declared, simply because they'd gone along really to see what it's all about. Well, I remember this during the Depression. There's a lot of hungry people around. Just to give you an idea of the Depression, about a quarter of the workforce in the United States worked on farms, and there was a real depression in the price of farm goods, and then the Dust Bowl issues in that what was it, the Southern Midwest, I think it was. Kansas, places like that, and then you had about 25% of the population, give or take, were really just labourers. That's all they were, day labourers in effect. This is again 1920s, 1930s, and so when the Great Depression hit, you've got unemployment of 25 to 30%, and in those times, a lot of people going hungry. If you look at the writings of the time, accommodation wasn't per se the main problem. The main problem that everyone seemed to be talking about was just getting enough to eat. And so any economy is purportedly as wealthy as the United States, and you've got millions of people can't get enough to eat. You, me, and anyone will question, well, hold on, there's something wrong with the system. this many millions of people can't get enough to eat. Wow, I mean, there's something wrong here. And anyone would think that. So they would go to the soup kitchen type stuff in Golden Gate Park or elsewhere around the United States. And then your mere attendance declares you or puts you out as a communist. I mean, that was very fucking far-fetched. And that sort of stuff, I think, was silly. And that happens on the peripheral edge of I think, any of these sorts of surveillance type and paranoid activities. But I think it's very different today. And I think the lesson of the past is don't go breaking the fucking law. Laws exist for a reason. They exist. I have to abide by the law, and so do you. And if we all abide by the law and abide by the rules, then we can sort it out. We've got the mechanisms in the Western society to sort it out through our body politic, through our supposedly independent courts, and so on. And that's how we work through that. But the globalists don't want to work through that because that stuffs and fucks up their program. So that gets in our way. We want to move all that, and we just want to accuse you of being a Nazi, and then that's the end of the story. And that's what we can't allow them to do. The mistakes of the past mustn't be repeated. And this is something I think is incredibly important. That saying, what we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. It's never more valid today than it's ever been. And if we look at sort of Omar Khayyam's writings, I think it was 12th century Persian philosopher, saying the mistakes of the past can't be changed, so we have to learn from the past. So the moving finger writes and having writ moves on, and they're all like piety, and they're all like wit can lure it back to cancel half a line. They're all like tears wash away one word of it. This was translated by Fitzgerald, who added in his own poetic license to that. But the issue remains the same, that we can't undo the mistakes of the past, but we don't have to repeat them either. You've been with Tassus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.